Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 2, Episode 11. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, this episode goes to 11, and we've got a great guest joining us, Lauren Thomas from CNBC. So thanks for facilitating that introduction. I think you two have met. I hadn't had the privilege, but I do follow her work on CNBC and her coverage of the retail beat.
Yeah, I guess I've known Lauren for, 2 or 3 years at this point. So I chat with her every once in a while. She's nice enough to quote me if on the off chance I say something halfway intelligible. So,
well, let's talk about that for a little bit, because one of the reasons we wanted to talk to a retail reporter, was to kind of get an outside looking in kind of perspective on what's going on in retail and what she thinks is important, because both at outside looking in and at a 10,000 foot level, right? She's covering a lot of stuff, looking at a lot of different things. So what she thinks is interesting and where the things are happening, I thought was a good opportunity to interview someone about it. But also I thought, I've been in the position, I don't know about you, but I've been in the position being on my own and being a podcaster, interacting, talking to media. And I just think it's good to get their perspective, because sometimes, depending on the size of the organization, you're going through comms people. It's tough to get to you. Maybe your story doesn't want to be told. Maybe you'd love to tell your story and don't know how. Yeah. What's been your experience talking to the media? Not as, Steve Dennis, the author and the consultant, but, even in your past life, what's been your experience?
Well, I have been in kind of a informal spokesperson role a couple of times, or participated in bigger press events. And in some ways, I think it's not that different than being out on my own and being the source, which is, I think a good reporter is very mindful of his or her audience and what they're most interested in, which isn't necessarily lined up with the story the company wants to tell. So I think to make it effective, and I'm sure plenty of public relations people are going to just roll their eyes because it's so obvious, but I think you really have to think about right. what is in it for the publication to feature your story. So, sometimes things are just super narrow, doesn't appeal to a wide enough audience because, it's about ultimately ratings or clicks or what have you. Sometimes it's finding that interesting angle because, you think about all the retailers, all the stuff they're doing, there's a million different stories, probably literally every day, every week. So I think it's trying to put yourself in their shoes.
Stories in the naked city, right? Million stories in the naked city, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting, what might have been interesting to me when I was in a certain job is not necessarily interesting to a heck of a lot of people. So sometimes it's just a matter of well, that's not really a story. But other times it might be a story, but you have to find the right angle. I think the other thing too, which is really helpful, which of course public relations, communications people, PR firms, et cetera, do all the time, is building those relationships. Because I think I've definitely had the situation where all of a sudden, we're really gung ho on getting some coverage for something, and it's well, great, I never heard from you before, or
you didn't return my call.
Yeah, right. Or you didn't return my call, or you weren't a source for a story. So I think you've got to play the long game in terms of building those relationships. And, I'll generally talk now today, since I've been doing this as opposed to working for a big company, I'm generally willing to talk to almost any reporter and try to help them out, even if there isn't anything right that moment selfishly for me. And so I suspect whether you're a big company, small company, figuring out who are the most important, most influential people in the press is worth doing, and cultivating those relationships and just trying to figure out, what is it really that's going to be of interest to their readers or viewers.
Yeah, it's great advice. I've had both the hat on of being a retailer and also being an advocate speaking on behalf of the entire industry. And you're right about facilitating and fostering relationships, because sometimes you're just talking on what reporters call on background.
Right.
In other words, I don't understand how curbside is so difficult. Explain that to me, because even the good retail reporters don't live and breathe the world of retail the way you and I do, or the operators do. So that's really beneficial. Let me ask you this question: what are your 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 tips for when you're being interviewed, how to approach it? Now, many of our listeners may have had media training, but I know I've got my own tricks and tips. But as you're being interviewed by media like Lauren and other folks, how do you approach that? Do you get prepared? Do you take it as it goes? Do you have notes? What do you do?
I mean, to the extent I know what they want to talk about, which usually I would because of the, left me a voicemail message or emailed me or whatever, texted me. I try to, try to crystallize my thoughts because, they're like everybody, they're busy. They may be talking to 10 other people. They may be on deadline, right? So I think being really efficient with your time by trying to crystallize your message. The second thing, which I don't want to make sound too sinister, but I think when I first started talking to the press when I was out on my own, like I didn't really think that I don't know what they're going to quote. I may think, oh, this is really interesting, and that's what they're going to quote. But I think you just have to be careful, kind of loose lips sink ships. Just really be mindful. And and I think good reporters are not going to, sabotage you on that. But it's not just a casual conversation with friends over a beer or something.
Right. It is a two-way. It's a very good point. It's a very good point. It is a two-way street. They need something from you. You need something from them. And as you said, the good reporters will tell you, listen, this is all on the record. So, you do have to be thoughtful, right? Mm-hmm. That's for sure. I mean, one of the things I've done particularly is listen. And it's a funny, it's a funny piece of advice, but I listen to many interviews or I talk to folks at retailers and they don't listen to the questions. They've got their 3 key speaking points that they want to get across and they don't listen to what they're being asked. And that, listening to people and what they talk about is really helpful in terms of, understanding what and how. There's some really interesting stuff there. So that would be my big piece of advice over and above, what your comms people would tell you, stay on point and assume everything's on the record and be careful, but also be interesting, right? Like you got to say something interesting or else.
Well, right. It's not you're not defending your PhD thesis on the future of omnichannel or whatever. You're giving a soundbite or something that can be distilled down in a broader context of a story. The only last thing I'd add, kind of following up on your point, is I think it's worth probing. If they ask them a question, there may be more behind the question. And they may not because they're trying to trick you or anything, but it may be that, they've heard something from somebody else and they're trying to test your knowledge or maybe they've got a really different angle on the way you would see it. So rather than just start blathering, I think it's, often useful just to say, hey, what, tell me a little bit more. Or do you have a hypothesis or an angle on this story? And usually get a little bit more color before you just start chatting away.
Listen, so we've got one of the best on with us, and I follow Lauren, and she covers the biggest stories. And again, thank you for connecting us. So let's kick it off. Let's talk to Lauren Thomas from CNBC.
Well, Michael and I are delighted to welcome CNBC's Lauren Thomas to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. Lauren, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks so much for having me. Rainy day in New York City, but happy to be here.
Well, Michael and I always get into, because he's in Toronto and I'm in Dallas, and of course we talk to people all over the world. We often have very different weather going on. But
exactly,
Lauren, we'd love to just start out if you could just tell us a bit about yourself and what you do, and I guess how you ended up in the primo retail reporter position at a relatively early age, at least relative to me, certainly.
To us.
Yeah, of course. Well, again, thank you both for having me. And yeah, I mean, CNBC is my first job out of college. So I've been with the company for a little over 4 years, I think it is at this point in time. And for most of that time covering retail. In college, so I went to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I'm originally from South Carolina, so didn't stay true, I guess, to my hometown state's alma mater, but decided to jump over the border and went to UNC, where I studied both business and journalism. I knew that I really enjoyed writing, so it was a matter of figuring out, I guess, how to turn that into a full-time career. And journalism seemed to be the logical route. And I met a professor at UNC actually early on who really convinced me that business journalism, financial journalism was a career worth pursuing. And in his mind, there weren't many, really trained business journalists out there today. And that it was just, if I started early, I guess, in pursuing some sort of degree where I'm studying both business and journalism, that I would maybe be a bit above my peers and the competition out there. yeah, and I mean, I was lucky to have some internships during college, actually one at CNBC. I studied at Bloomberg one summer as well, and just really enjoyed kind of the pace and the stories that come with financial news and digging into SEC filings and quarterly earnings reports and that sort of thing. So when I ended up accepting a job at CNBC out of college, and this was a bit by luck that the retail reporter at the time happened to be leaving. So timing was really on my side in that case, because I started out just doing more general assignment coverage. That's often how you start out at CNBC, so that you get a taste of everything before you really develop a beat within the company. And so I just kind of stepped in and was helping her cover her, fill her shoes, in the interim while they were looking to fill that role. And they ended up offering me the retail reporter job full time, which I graciously accepted. Really, I love covering this industry because it is so consumer facing and something that I feel like most anyone and everyone can relate to. We all shop. Yep. And so, I think a lot of journalists that cover retail would agree that that's one of the big appeals to it. And just how it can touch so many people in the stories, even if they are financial related, obviously, as they are at CNBC, they're still very relevant to so many people. I've been doing that ever since. And again, I couldn't have ever in college imagined, I'm going to cover retail full time. Right. But certainly is an industry that appeals to me.
And was it hard for you to kind of get up to speed? It's Michael and I often say, not in the context of journalism per se, but just, retail is such a big, diverse industry. So it's hard enough, even if you've been in it a long time. Was it hard for you to get up to speed, or how'd you go about building that knowledge base?
Obviously there are like decades worth, some of these department stores, Sears. I mean, well, the history of some of these companies dates back to like the early 1900s. And me stepping into this beat in the 2000s there's a lot to learn. There was a lot to learn. So a lot of my early days, I think, were spent talking to people, like yourself, that are really knowledgeable on this industry. And then as I kind of figured out the companies that I would cover closely, day to day, and really wanted to follow because I knew those were the ones that the CNBC audience was most interested in, really spent time getting up to speed with people within the business, kind of hearing the story from folks on the communication side. But yeah, I mean, just trying to read and learn as much as possible. I have a stack of books in my apartment, the history of department stores, a book on Sears, history of malls, and Steve's book in the stack as well. But so a lot of reading.
You really only need mine. That's my preference.
Yeah, no, honestly.
Streamline the whole process, Lauren. Streamline the whole process. Save you a lot of time, right?
Yeah, 20 books in one. No, really though, a lot of weekend reading. But yeah, and so you got to learn the lingo and all of that as well. So it takes time, and I by no means would call myself 100% expert today. But
listening to your background, it reminds me of that saying, "The harder I work, the luckier I get." So it's clear you're right. I mean, you got a pretty great beat, but it sounds like you work really hard for it. Can we dip into your tradecraft for a little bit? Mm-hmm. When you as a reporter, you mentioned how dynamic the industry was. That can work for you or against you, so to speak. There's so much going on. Some stories are interesting but not important. Some are interesting but kind of a distraction. And I mean, we're simple podcasters, and we get sometimes dozens of hey, we got great news. We're coming out with something like stories to follow. How do you, in your tradecraft and training, how do you sort through what you're going to focus on? You mentioned, what you think the CNBC audience or readers and listeners and online surfers are going to be interested in. So take me through a little bit of that. Where do you start that journey, and how do you think about it?
Yeah. And I mean, it really, one day you could think that you're going to be working on something and you've got one project you're hoping to chip away at. And then suddenly, the news cycle does a 180, and that suddenly changes. So there's definitely a lot of that, within my field, journalists can all really relate. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, at CNBC, our bread and butter is business news. So what does that look like? I mean, for me, it's the big publicly traded retailers that I cover, like Macy's, like Nike, Lululemon, Gap, I know that every quarter I have to cover their earnings, for example. So that's one story. I kind of check that box. It's earnings coverage. Does take up a big chunk of my time. And, investor meetings and meetings with shareholders are another thing that I definitely, want to make sure that I'm covering, again, for those big public retailers that I care about. I kind of have a spreadsheet that I'm constantly checking with market caps, just to see how that's ebbed and flowed, because that does play into some of my sorting out my coverage and what I want to focus on. Because some of these names, I mean, Steve, you can potentially relate or attest to this. I forget that some of these companies, like you might think, some of these holding companies like a Capri or, they might not mean a lot, I guess, to you when you first hear it, but then you look at their market cap and you're like, oh, they're pretty big. So that, it's something that I need to pay attention to. Again, from more of this, like an investor lens. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, I think it really, you have to look at the bigger, like what's going on in the news. So right now, this Georgia voting law, for example, is really something that CNBC as a whole is paying attention to. And as CEOs, are chiming in, and more companies are issuing statements as it relates to that. So, then I'm asked within the organization, to make sure that I'm looking at, again, like a Nike or a Coca-Cola or Pepsi, a Home Depot, like what are these companies saying? And so that ties into this bigger, national news story, and then trying to find the retail angle within that. Or during the pandemic, as stimulus checks have been given out, as a retail consumer reporter, it's looking into, okay, where is that money going and what are they spending that on? So it's constantly changing. I mean, this past year, COVID has kind of thrown us all this curveball in coverage that we never could have anticipated. There have been times when it's just consistently a lot of bankruptcies happening in retail, and they all sort of seem to hit at once. So there's a wave of those sorts of stories. So really ebbs and flows. But again, I think like day to day, I have in my mind, the core companies that I focus on that I know are bigger and just are really relevant with our readers. And so that's what I'm making sure that I'm not missing anything there. One interesting thing to really quickly build on that, kind of the fitness space, that was something, pre-pandemic, I didn't really cover fitness equipment makers, but you have Peloton all of a sudden kind of explode in popularity. So now Peloton, companies like Peloton and Tonal and Hydro, Mirror, which was acquired by Lululemon during the pandemic, those were kind of added into my universe of coverage. Again, never could have predicted that, but with this, everyone suddenly working out at home, those businesses are a lot more relevant. So just, another example of how that is really constantly changing.
So it sounds like you put down a kind of a foundation of reporting on, the public information you can access. You're listening to earnings calls and you're
right.
Doing that kind of foundational reporting stuff just to kind of track and create in your own mind, even just indexes of who's doing well, who's doing less well, who's doing something interesting. Now that also, I'm sure, involves calling folks up and give me some advice to the listeners when they see your name in the email or they see your name on a call. I mean, not everybody wants their story to be told in such a way.
Right.
I'm sure you run into that, right? Sometimes it's like, I'd really not rather talk about it, but talk about that element of your reporting, like from an advice perspective. If retailers see your name on the call display, and maybe it's not through the comms people, but just give me a sense of how you work through that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Because I think as a journalist, that's something you think about a lot, is like how you're perceived and how other people think about you, or like you said, what they're thinking when they see your name pop up or your email attached to a subject line. I was just talking to a friend the other day actually about this idea that I do feel like, sometimes even with friends, that there's like a wall that's put up just because they're talking to a journalist and there's a reporter in the room. And I often have friends joke at dinners and when we're grabbing coffee, like, oh, this is off the record and that sort of
no
thing.
such thing. There's no such thing as off the record, as the communications folks would tell us, right? No such thing. Does it exist?
I think it exists, or at least I try to make sure that they believe me when I say that it exists.
At least on background, right? At least some of the conversations you have are on background, right?
Oh, absolutely, on background. And I mean, that's an important distinction to know what's on background, what's off the record. But I think building trust in to that's something that I aspire to do, I guess, with a lot of my sources and resources, people that I know within the industry. But to go back to your question, I mean, if it's like a cold call or an initial conversation with someone, I think, making sure that they know, and again, this might be hard to do because there is a perception of journalists that some people might believe for better or for worse, but making sure they know that this conversation is totally just off the record, on background. I literally just want to say hi and get to know you a little bit. I think that that's something that I try to do in those initial conversations. Like, this is not for a story, lay the ground rules, I guess, the framework there for the conversation, that it's not for anything, not for quotes. I mean, I find that that's the best way to go. And then moving forward, okay, maybe, we have a second call if there's something that you said that you allow me to poke around on, or that we could potentially turn into a story or an anecdote or something down the road, and then could follow up for some sort of thoughts or quotes to be included in a piece. But it's tough. I mean, I try to come across as I never want to be perceived as a threat per se, I guess. I mean, that's maybe other reporters think differently, but I've found that that's not the best way to go, I guess. And I would rather, just make sure that we're on a common ground and there's an understanding of what the purpose of the conversation is. Because I think that's where you often run into maybe the most trouble, when there is a misunderstanding and maybe that person does think that you're only reaching out for a story or quotes. You want to quote them as this employee in a Best Buy store or whatever it might be, and just totally out them. So, but it's tough. I mean, I've had my fair share of messages, and I'm sure will continue to, where people just don't want to talk, and I totally understand that. So I think a lot of it boils down to persistence. I use LinkedIn daily, probably, maybe too much, but spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I think it's a great resource to look for people, whether they're, internal, an employee, or just public relations folks that are worth getting to know, or consultants and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of persistence until you find the right folks.
So now that you've been at this for several years and I mean, gone through COVID, you've covered a wide range of different stories, companies, sectors, et cetera. Are there a few things that have surprised you about the industry, and maybe some things that perhaps you think don't get quite enough attention?
Yeah, so a few things come to mind initially on that front. I think one of them is, and I mean, I'm a consumer, like I was saying earlier, we all shop. And so that's how our connection to the retail world. But I think it surprised me just how quickly consumers' tastes can evolve. And then in turn, a lot of what we're following is what are they doing, or maybe the lack of what they're doing to adapt to that. But yeah, just the quick, changing nature, I guess, of consumers, and what, they might be buying something one day, or one style of apparel is really in vogue one day, and then the next day it's out. So I think that's one thing that I was pretty, I guess, I don't know, kind of sparked my curiosity a bit. And, as a reporter, I see a lot of these surveys and constantly, people are sending me data, or I'm poking around for data. And that's one thing that I think I've always found pretty fascinating, is just the nature of that taste, consumer taste, and how that's evolving. And obviously that ultimately is going to entail where they want to shop and how they want to shop and all that sort of stuff, which I know Steve, you know well. Obviously, I know that's a kind of a core component of your book. But yeah, I would say that's one thing. Again, I think the pandemic has proven to us, where they're shopping, just how quickly that can change, and kind of the growing acceptance and really getting comfortable with buying online. I think that it's surprised me in some ways, like ordering groceries, for example. I think we're starting to see some data that has really picked up during the pandemic, but it looks like that might stick, longer term. And so where online grocery shopping, might become a permanent behavior for more people than we initially expected. So I think, again, just that's kind of the education component there maybe shocked me a little bit of how quickly, customers are sticking with that.
Well, I was just going to say, so I'd love, in a couple of minutes we have left, I'd love just to get maybe your take on things we should be looking out for going ahead, or things that are kind of on your radar screen. But in particular, as we start to come out of the depths of the COVID crisis and so many retailers start to anniversary last year's numbers, one of the things Michael and I have talked about a couple of times is just how weird the comparisons are going to be and how hard it might be to discern what good looks like. Are you worried about that? Do you think people should be really looking at these comparisons, say, to 2019 as opposed to 2020?
Yes.
How are you going to sort through that?
It's so top of mind. And so glad you brought that up, because we were literally having this discussion as a team internally this morning at CNBC, because we've got, I've got earnings later this week that I'm covering. So we're kind of getting into the thick of this earnings cycle again. And I think different companies are going to spin this different ways. So I think it's going to be especially important to kind of pay attention to the details, and you need that additional context, I think. Like, the companies that have done really well, for example, like Target and Walmart, I mean, it's no surprise. They've been very strong throughout this pandemic. They've got a great presence online, and so that's benefited them, but people have still been going to their stores as well. And so they had really strong numbers in 2020. So now in 2021, they're lapping those 2020 numbers. So I think we're starting to see some of those companies use these 2-year stack, reporting on a 2-year basis, because it's better for them to almost look at it that way. And because then if they're doing 2021 to 2020 comparison, the numbers this year, they're likely not going to be as strong as what they saw last year, because last year was just an astronomically, like, a great year for them. So they're comping that. That's tough. So it's better for them and they can maybe tell the story better if they do it on this 2-year basis. So comping 2019, which was more of a quote unquote normal year for them. But then you've got kind of the mall-based universe is how I might refer to it. So apparel retailers, for example, they didn't have a great 2020. So when they report 2021 numbers, I mean, you're going to see
home runs every quarter.
Great growth. So they don't. I mean, they don't need to play around with this 2-year stack figure, right? Necessarily. So it's I mean, I think, and everyone so far. I mean, I've listened to a few conference calls already. And again, it depends on when retailers' quarters, and some of them are on a fiscal year, so it's a little bit different. But I mean, they're all working through this a little bit differently. So I saw someone tweet that they saw in a filing today, like, ex-pandemic revenue. Like, I just feel like we're going to see so many different, like, figures and new terminology, and companies are going to, like, try to play around with this. I mean, it makes it hard for the analysts as well, that are, they come up with their own estimates, and I don't know how they're working through all this. So I think some of that might be off, but I think bottom line, it's like, we're, as reporters, we're going to have to take this, like, company by company and, like, really read the whole release, look at the charts versus reading into their language and how they phrase it, I think, to get the whole story of what's going on. Cause I mean, up 20% kind of means nothing to me, right? Unless I know, like, what happened last year. So it's going to be tricky. Yeah.
Well, you've given me the idea now to quote my weight ex-pandemic. That'll be.
Honestly, you are not alone.
Obviously, a lot of narrative around COVID, maybe the effect of stimulus checks, those kinds of things. Anything else that we haven't talked about that's on your radar screen, our listeners, you say, "No, boy, this I think is super interesting," or really start paying attention to this?
Sure. Well, and again, and this isn't new per se, but I definitely think it's important, and it's something that I know Steve, you're watching too, and you've discussed at length. We've probably had conversations about it together. Is the state of malls, shopping malls. It's one area that I like to dive into at CNBC and cover that when I can. It's just, as retailers are closing stores, what is happening to the quote unquote like mall blueprint. It's not what it was a few decades ago, not even what it was a year ago. And so just really continuing to follow, we've seen some of these mall operators file for bankruptcy themselves during the pandemic because they've been hurt so much, whether it's, rent checks aren't coming in on time and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think that's kind of a pocket within the retail coverage landscape, you could say, that I just find really interesting. And I mean, at the end of the day, these malls are often like a tax driver, a source of revenue for the communities that they're in. So there's huge ripple effects there. So I think that's an area worth staying on top of the rest of this year and beyond.
Well, absolutely. Never a dull moment in retail. I used to say one of the things I liked about retail was how dynamic it is. And certainly the last year has taught us it's hyper dynamic or whatever we want to call it. But well, thanks so much, Lauren, for joining us. I hope everybody, if you haven't been following Lauren's work at CNBC, you go check that out. Any place else you'd like to point people to learn more about you and what you do?
That's really the best. I mean, I could shout out, Twitter and LinkedIn. I guess those are the two channels where I'm most prolific, other than CNBC.com. So, but yeah, you'll find it all there.
Excellent. Well, we'll also put links in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us, Lauren, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
All right, Steve, that was a great interview. It was great to get the perspective of, as I said, someone looking at the industry from the outside in, and it's great for Lauren to take the time and chat with us.
Yeah, she's really, it's pretty amazing how quickly she's gotten to this position. And I think, you and I were talking off mic about how helpful it is for, it's a hard enough industry to learn anyway. And, but those reporters that have that business background and are able to focus and get that, get up that learning curve quickly is really helpful, making sense of, particularly all the things that are going on in general, but particularly the last year or so. So she does a great job of doing that. So it's good to have her on.
All right, we're back with Remarkable or Forgettable. Steve, let's start with a red herring. 80,000 stores are closing. The bold prediction. What do we think?
Well, I would call this remarkable because I think it's extremely misguided, mainly from a logic standpoint. I certainly don't have the ability to really sit down and come up with my own exact number for how many stores are going to close in 5 years' time. But I think this approach, which is, I think, a common one, basically assumes that sales are migrating away from physical stores to online exclusively, and then just tries to play with math to say how many stores do we need to close for physical stores to hit a target sales productivity. And I think that's just fundamentally the wrong way to think about it. Not that a lot of stores aren't going to close, but I think the role, as we've talked about a few times now, the role of physical stores in the overall brand experience is important, and that will keep the numbers of store closings, I think, to a much, much lesser number than this estimate.
Well, let's talk of the other side of the coin, because that's the part that sometimes doesn't make it into the media, but it's what drove you and I crazy about the whole retail apocalypse narrative was they looked at one side of the ledger, not the other. The store opening. So, in the news alone this week, we're hearing Lululemon, we're hearing Lego, we're hearing opening Urban Outfitters. What's going on there? They seem to be going in the opposite direction of that sentiment.
Yeah, the reason I thought this was particularly interesting or remarkable is that when we've talked about store openings, it's been a lot on the value side of the equation. Dollar stores, off price, the TJX, Burlington, Ross. That's been the big driver, as well as a few retailers that just haven't expanded as far as they could, like, say, a Tractor Supply or Dick's Sporting Goods. But these retailers, the Lululemons, the Legos, the Urban Outfitters, these aren't the value players. These are the more upscale or specialty type players. And I think that just suggests there's still a lot of room there for brands that have a really remarkable value proposition executed well, where the integration or the blend of their stores and e-commerce is what makes them successful. So I don't think this will be the last of some pretty significant names we hear that'll be opening dozens, maybe even hundreds of stores.
Are malls in trouble?
Well, in total, I would say malls are in trouble. So the data was that the vacancy rate in the U.S. went from 10.5% to 11.4%, which apparently was a record. Kind of lost in this whole discussion is that vacancies in malls in total have been going up since, I think, 2015, 2016, something like that. So this is kind of forgettable, and this is not really new news. And again, this is one of the situations where you've got the so-called A malls, which are doing quite well. And I think on average have 95, 96% occupancy.
Yeah. And very productive. Yeah.
Yeah. Very productive, attracting there are pockets of difficulty for sure. I don't want to say like it's all rosy. And certainly because COVID affected department stores and apparel retailers disproportionately, I think there's definitely
and commuters, right? Because we have a mall here in Toronto, Eaton Centre, which is 55 million visitors, but a lot of them are because it's hooked up to the subway, right? It's a major artery.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit of a challenge now, and with the slower upstart of going back to work, that could be a challenge just because it is, right? Just because that's the fundamental nature of the
Yeah. So that's, I think, hopefully a lot of that will start to come back next year, but I think it's really a tale of two cities. You got the A malls, which for the most part are fine, even if they've taken kind of a short-term hit. Then you've got the B and C, D malls, which for the most part are in trouble. And so I expect that, you really need to pay attention to which category of malls are we talking about. One thing to keep in mind is that in the US, the A malls are I forget the exact number, but something like 20% by count, but 75% by volume. So that's another thing just to really pay attention is, how much total square footage or how much volume does the contraction in malls really mean?
Well, speaking of contraction in malls, the news is that perhaps Amazon's going to buy some of these malls and use them for distribution centers. Does that make sense to you? Do you think that's a trend?
Well, I think that something like 25 have already, or over the last couple of years, have already happened. I still think this is mostly forgettable in that I don't think this is going to be a massive strategy. I think the thing that is true with a lot of malls is typically they're located close to highways. They have good access, egress, population density, and a lot of things that are good characteristics for distribution centers. But they're often very difficult to work with because you have to spend a lot of money to get them to be reconfigured. You've got maybe issues
low ceilings, whatever.
Yeah. So you're talking about some really complicated conversions, and oftentimes the neighborhood's not super excited that you're going to be there, or the other retailers don't want you there that are nearby. Traffic issues, that kind of stuff. So I think there are certainly there will continue to be opportunities basically where the land value is what they're going for. They're going to bulldoze the thing. And as long as they can get through the community issues, and, a lot of communities are going to want the tax dollars, particularly if it's a really dead mall that hasn't been contributing. So, my guess is this is, a dozen a year, not suddenly, every mall that closes is going to be an Amazon center.
Let's talk about Best Buy. And by the way, just a nod to listeners, we're going to have Hubert Joly, the former CEO, on very soon, actually, just talking about his new book. But Best Buy announced a membership program. We've seen these before, of course, Costco, to Amazon Prime, to, many people launching loyalty programs that are really wrapped around a membership program. What do you think of this initiative?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting. Right now, I think it's only 40, 50 stores, something like that, a few cities. So it's kind of hard to declare this remarkable at this point. But I think it's $199. You get free shipping. You get some tech support, extended warranties wrapped in. I think there's a lot of interest for good reason in creating these bundles, or as Scott Galloway calls them, rundles, where you've got recurring revenue. So the ability to lock in the customer, I think can be powerful, but there are only a few retailers I think that can really pull this off. You have to really be spending a fair amount of dollars, whether that's frequently, which works for Walmart Plus, Amazon, Costco, or a lot of dollars, which can definitely work for Best Buy, and Restoration Hardware's got a membership type program as well where you get discounts. So I think interesting, potentially remarkable as a strategy for most retailers. I think it's pretty limited to some of the really big guys.
All right, last thing. Target is allocated $2 billion to Black-owned businesses. What do you think of that? That's a great announcement.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. I mean, first of all, it's obviously a ton of money. Secondly, I think it's part of we've seen a lot of initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think as a investor relations, public relations strategy, as well as just the right thing to do, I think it's terrific. And I really like when companies that are well known, certainly, get out there and make a statement about important issues, because I think that will encourage other companies to look at it and perhaps follow them. Sometimes for the wrong reason. Maybe they just do it because they feel like they have to. But fundamentally, I think Target's been a big leader in community and public affairs, and this is just another good example. So I think it's great.
All right. Well, that was another edition of Remarkable or Forgettable. Another great episode, Steve. Take us home.
Well, if you liked what you heard, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up with all our great interviews and insights, and new episodes will show up every week. And please take a minute to drop us that elusive 5-star rating. I'm Steve Dennis. For my latest insights, follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, and be sure to order your copy of the second edition of Remarkable Retail from just about anywhere books are sold.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast. You can learn more about me on www.emmyleblanc.co. Steve, have a great week.